On the rocky hill of the Pinks, thousands of citizens shuffle into place to hold an assembly. Stragglers down in the agora hastened upward, trying to dodge the vermilion rope borne by the Scythian slave archers, a long cord dipped in red pigment, intended to herd tardy citizens toward their civic duties. Any man marked by the telltale red stain might find himself incurring a fine for sloth and a sprinkling of shame to the mix. Such was the mixture of the earnest participation and comic spectacle that characterized Athenian democracy. In this direct democratic system, the first of its kind in the world, by the way, ordinary male citizens gathered to debate war and peace, laws, treaties, and taxes. They needed no elected parliament to represent them. The demos, that being the people, ruled themselves by collective voice and vote. The scene on the Pinks, with merchants and farmers jostling alongside aristocrats to speak or at least to shout yes or no, would have seemed quite astonishing to earlier ages governed by kings and oligarchs. But how exactly did this radically open political system actually work in practice? We're talking a society of perhaps 30 to 40,000 citizens. How did they manage to govern themselves without presidents, parliaments, or a bureaucratic state machinery as we understand it? That's the question for today. Greek democracy. What was it? And how did it work? Now, of course, we think of Athens, and rightly so. But Athens was not the only polis or city-state to embrace some form of popular rule, but it certainly did become the quintessential model of Greek democracy. Other cities, notably Syracuse, Rhodes, Argos, Erythrae, had their own democratic or quasi-democratic regimes at times. And of course we can't go past Sparta, famous for its kings and elders. Even they had an assembly of citizens with limited powers, known as the appella, a faint echo of democracy's principle, that authority ultimately rested with people. Yet nowhere was democracy as fully developed or fully documented as in Athens. By the mid-5th century BC, Athens had transformed from an aristocratic clan-based society into a polis, where any adult male citizen could literally step into the arena of governance. As Pericles proudly proclaimed in 431, our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. So today we're going to talk about all the Athenian democratic institutions, and of course cross-reference them with other Greek polises. We talk about the assembly, the ekklesia, the council, boule, and the people's courts, dikasteria, and of course the cultural practices that sustained them, from the reforms of Solon and Cleisthenes through to the heyday of democratic decision-making in the Persian and Peloponnesian wars, to the philosophical reflections and all the criticisms that Athenian democracy provoked. Well, what's a system of government without criticism? Welcome to the channel, everyone. We are here, of course, to discuss Greek democracy. Are you excited? It's important to understand, and I think by the end of it you will realize, well, perhaps the democracy we have now is not quite the democracy that was of the ancient world. Well, if you've not yet subscribed, I invite you to do so. Also remember, this video and all the other videos on the channel are 100% ad-free, and proudly so. And this is because of the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who chose the random donation, and those who checked out the merch store. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Well, let's begin, starting from Solon, as far as we can go back. Now, Athenian democracy did not really spring up overnight. It wasn't a click of the fingers invention. Rather, it emerged through a series of reforms and power struggles in the 6th century BCE. As Athens shifted away from aristocratic rule and tyranny towards a government by the citizens. It all starts with Solon, Archon in 594 BCE. He's often hailed as an early architect of this political evolution. He was a poet, statesman, who enacted broad reforms to heal social strife between the noble landowners and the impoverished farmers of Attica. He abolished debt bondage, that is, freeing many Athenians from slavery to creditors, and reorganized citizens into 4 economic classes, these classes based on their agricultural yield. As for political participation, well, under Solon this was still quite stratified. The highest offices were reserved for the wealthiest classes. But crucially, Solon opened the assembly, that being the ekklesia, to the lower courts, to all citizens, even the poorest. He also established a new council, about 400 members, 100 from each of the 4 traditional tribes, to set the agenda for the assembly. These Solonian reforms did not create a democracy as later Athenians knew it, but they did inject the idea of what they call isonomia, that is, equality under law. This new idea coming into the political culture, giving ordinary citizens a stake in their own governance. Herodotus later remarked that after Solon's laws, although factional troubles continued, of course, the Athenians had gotten a taste for equality and freedom of speech. And of course, once you get a taste for it, it's hard to get it out of your mind, right? Of course, pave the way for deeper changes. But this wasn't a one-and-done situation. Very much far from it. Soon after Solon, Athens fell under the sway of tyranny. A single-man rule of Pisistratos, and his sons, is from 546 to 510 BCE. Now let's just backpedal a little bit. This term tyrant, because when we hear it in our modern vernacular, it has some connotations. But in Greek, it did not necessarily mean a cruel oppressor. Pisistratos, in fact, governed moderately and fostered economic prosperity. Yet tyranny by nature bypassed the nascent institutions of citizen governance. It was only after the last tyrant, Hippias, was expelled, with an assist from the Spartan king Cleomenes, that Athens had the opportunity to reinvent its constitution. And it was here, at this very critical moment in 508, a power struggle ensued between Isagoras, an aristocrat favoring oligarchy, and Cleisthenes of the Alcmaeonid clan, who courted the support of the common people. Cleisthenes emerged victorious by rallying the masses. As Herodotus tells us, Cleisthenes took the people into his party, and was thus able to outmaneuver his rivals. And what he did next earned him the title of the father of Athenian democracy. A debatable title, but a pretty general one, and we're going to run with it. Cleisthenes' reforms were sweeping and intentionally designed to break the power of the old noble factions. He abolished the old 4-tribe system based on family clans and created 10 new tribes, citizens from all parts of Attica. Each new tribe, called a phyle, was a cross-section of society. combining demes as villages or precincts from the city, coast, and the inland farming regions. This geographic mixing meant that local loyalties and aristocratic clan networks were diluted, forging a broader civic identity. An Athenian now identified himself by his deme, that is the local community, and tribe, rather than solely just a family lineage. In fact, Cleisthenes decreed that citizens should be known by their deme names instead of their patronymics, specifically to obscure who was newly enrolled as a citizen and to emphasize civic belonging over any sort of lineage. For example, instead of Callias, son of Xanthibos, one might be called Callias of Acharnae, or Callias of Athens, or whatever it is. Now this measure, as Aristotle notes, prevented prejudice against naturalized or lower-class citizens, and symbolized the new egalitarian ethos. Alongside the tribal reform, Cleisthenes expanded the council to 500 members, with 50 councillors chosen from each of the 10 tribes. This council of 500 would become a central steering committee for the democracy, preparing business for the assembly and managing daily administrative tasks. By increasing the council and tribal units, Cleisthenes ensured a wider pool of citizens rotated through public service. He also introduced the institution of ostracism, though it was first used a few years later, as a safeguard to protect the young democracy from would-be tyrants or overly dominant or ambitious politicians. Under this law, the assembly could once a year hold a vote to exile one citizen for 10 years, with no loss of property or status. A dramatic precaution, that's for sure, aimed at preventing any single individual from amassing too much power. Well, it's certainly no exaggeration to say that Cleisthenes democratized Athens. Aristotle observes that after these reforms, quote, the constitution became much more democratic than that of Solon. Cleisthenes had empowered the common people, the demos. The very word, demokratia, people's power, likely came into use soon after to describe the new order. Interestingly, the final author of these changes was the Athenian people themselves. Once Cleisthenes gave them the tools of self-government, they continued to develop and defend their democracy. A vivid anecdote in Herodotus shows the effect of this new-found freedom. You see, shortly after the reforms, Athens' military and civic performance surged. Herodotus writes that the Athenians, quote, while ruled by tyrants, were no better in war than their neighbors, but after they got rid of tyrants, they became the first. This proves that when they were oppressed, they let themselves grow slack, but when freed, each man was keen to work for himself. Now, in other words, this political freedom unleashed an individualistic energy. Well, this insight that people fight and strive harder for a community of which they are a real part of was not lost on the Greeks. It became part of the ideological justification for democracy, that free citizens would outperform their subjects and slaves. After all, the old question in war is, what are we fighting for? Well, if there's something to fight for, perhaps people will be more willing to pick up the spear. So let's talk about the institutions. By the mid-5th century BCE, Athens had developed the classic institutions of its democracy. There were 3 main bodies of governance, each involving large numbers of citizens and providing checks and balances to the other. The first, of course, being the assembly, the ekklesia, the sovereign governing body of all citizens. And then we have the Council of 500, the boule, or the voule in Greek, if we're going to be technical with pronunciations, which I'm sure someone will be in the comments. This was the agenda setting and executive committee, composed of citizens chosen by lot. And then we have the people's courts, the dikasteria, large citizen juries that handled judicial functions and could hold leaders accountable. In addition, there were many public officials, magistrates and military officers, who were either elected or chosen by lot, and a few residual elite institutions like the Areopagus Council. This is a council of ex-archons with limited, mostly judicial roles by the 5th century. So let's take a look at each one of these major democratic institutions and discuss their functions. First, we have the assembly, or we call it the ekklesia. It was the beating heart of the democracy. It was a gathering of all male citizens, 20 years of age or older, who wished to attend. Unlike a modern parliament, the assembly had no fixed roster of representatives. It was rather a direct democracy. Any eligible citizen could walk right in, take a seat on the Pink's Hill, and participate in the debate and voting. The assembly met regularly, at least 40 times a year in the 4th century, and often more frequently during crises. But generally you did not want them, didn't you? Typically, meetings were held 4 times each prytany. That is, Athens divided its year into 10 periods, one for each tribal presidency, as we will see shortly. In the 5th century, meetings might have been less regular, but were convened as needed, often with shorter notice. For an example, before a major military expedition or after some alarming news. An agenda would be set by the council and posted in advance. The assembly had an official meeting place too. We've mentioned it, the Pinks, a hill just west of the Acropolis, with a stone podium for speakers and sufficient open space to accommodate thousands. And attendance, that could range quite widely. For routine matters, or perhaps on rainy days, only a few thousand might show up. But for momentous votes, like declarations of war or ostracisms, the turnout could approach or exceed 6,000 citizens, which by law was a quorum for especially important decisions. And indeed 6,000, this was a symbolic number in Athenian democracy, not only in the quorum for the assembly's most significant acts, but also roughly the size of the annual jury pool. The principle was that large numbers guarded against factional capture. In a city of perhaps 250,000 inhabitants, including women, children, slaves, resident foreigners, so on, the political franchise of 30,000 adult male citizens meant a very broad base by ancient standards, even if modern eyes note the exclusions. So in the assembly, each citizen had its right, their right to speak rather, a cherished concept known as isegoria, equal speech. The meeting typically began with a sacrifice and prayers for the gods' favor. Often a piglet was sacrificed to purify the area, showing how religion and politics intertwined in Greek life. A herald would invoke a curse on any speaker who intended to deceit against the people, underscoring that to speak was to accept a kind of moral responsibility. The presiding officers, chosen by lot from the council and serving short terms, then presented their matters to be discussed, which could include new laws called decrees, foreign policy decisions, wartime strategy, financial matters, legal judgments in certain political trials, and so on. Of course, the debate was open. It's what isegoria is all about. Citizens would raise their hands to claim the floor and address the assembly. In practice, speaking effectively before a crowd of peers required quite a bit of courage, skill, and some reputation. Thus, while in theory, any citizen, even of the most humble of origins, could speak, in practice, a relatively small cadre of able orators and leaders, often from the upper classes or with natural talent, dominated the debate. Now, this was not by rule at all, but by the realities of rhetoric and persuasion. Well, think about it in more practical terms. If you are in a room full of 6,000 people, and even if it's on a topic that you understand, let's say, can somebody get up here and explain how a combustion engine works? Something like this. Perhaps something a little less simple, but you know what I'm getting at. And you're an expert on combustion engines. Well, that's all good and well. But standing up in front of 6,000 people and talking, entirely different skill set, I'm sure you'll agree. Well, after debate, the vote was taken. Most often voting was by show of hands. Now they had a word for it too. It's kerotonia, literally the stretching out of the hand. Now, with the presiding officers judging each side of the majority, this is how they did it. By particularly critical matters like ostracism or certain trials, secret ballots could be used. Ostracism employed pottery shards or ostraka, each scratched with a name. We're very lucky to keep finding them buried underground. No secret ballot was generally needed for laws and decrees. The openness of the vote was in keeping with the norm of transparency. Each citizen's stance was visible to his fellows. A simple majority decided the issue. As for the assembly's powers, they were quite broad. It made laws and decrees, elected certain officials, declared war and peace, approved treaties, and served as a high court for important political trials, for example, impeachments or cases of treason. By the later 5th century, as the system evolved, many judicial functions were delegated to courts, but the assembly always retained the right to initiate or order major prosecutions, that is, against generals or magistrates for misconduct. So in principle, the assembly was supreme. There was no distinction between legislative, executive, and judicial branches in Athens, like in our modern day. All authority ultimately rested with the demos acting in assembly or through large juries. Well, if the assembly, in its sovereign capacity, ever violated existing law, the only remedy was retrospective, to hold accountable the individual who had proposed the unconstitutional act, through a mechanism we will discuss in a moment, the graph paranomon. Thus, the Athenians placed faith in the collective wisdom of the citizenry, even if occasionally that collective could err or be misled. Well, next up we have this Council of 500, the boule or boule sometimes. It complements the assembly and acted as a steering committee and executive arm of the democracy. Let me explain. As reformed by Cleisthenes, the council had 500 members, 50 citizens from each of the 10 tribes, and each year they were chosen anew by lot. Selection by lot, that is, random sortition, was considered the most democratic method, since it did not favor the rich, the famous, or eloquent. Any citizen, typically over 30 years old for the council, could be drawn up for service. However, there had to be some practical limits. They couldn't just let everyone in. One had to pass a basic scrutiny, called a dokimasia, confirming one's citizenship and that one had no outstanding debts to the state or record of serious misconduct. Kind of like a background check. Think of it like that. Oh, and no citizen could serve on the council more than twice in a lifetime, nor 2 years in a row, and that ensured that rotation and broad participation would be across generations. Pretty good rules, I think. The 500 councillors, called the boule, worked almost every day. They met in the council house, called the boulitarion, in the agora, the city centre marketplace, and dealt with the continuous administrative needs of Athens. The council's most important role was preparing the agenda for the assembly, drafting the preliminary proposals that the larger citizen body would debate and vote on. In effect, the council filtered and organized the new business of state so that the assembly's time was not wasted. Because we can't have a government assembly just wasting time now, can't we? Well, for example, if a new law was to be proposed, it often went through the council first for refinement. The council also oversaw state finances, received assembly decisions, or rather, ambassadors and foreign envoys, supervised public works, and ensured that assembly decisions were implemented by the officials. Excuse me for reading the wrong line, rather. Now, it could also issue orders and minor decrees on its own, if it were in accordance with general policies. In emergencies, crises, that kind of thing, the council might act on behalf of the assembly, though major decisions still required later ratification by the assembly, so it wasn't a one-and-done solution. Of course, the workload was quite heavy, one can imagine, and to manage this, the council had an internal structure of committees by tribe called Cleisthenes. Now, the year was divided into 10 equal parts, as we've said, each about 36 days given a lunar calendar, and each tribe's 50 members served as the Cleisthenes, the presiding committee, in rotation for 1/10 of the year. During its prytany, these 50 councillors effectively were the executive committee. They convened and chaired council meetings, and also summoned and presided over meetings of the assembly. From among each group of 50, a chairman, epistates, was chosen by lot each day. A remarkably short term, literally just one day as the head of state. This daily chairman was entrusted with the city's state seal and keys to the treasuries and temples for that day only. It's a very quick turnaround. Of course, a dizzying rotation such as this, 500 councillors, 50 on duty for 36 days and one chosen each day as chairman, ensured that executive power could never concentrate in one man or clique for too long. The polar opposite of a permanent bureaucracy, a constantly changing cast of ordinary citizens, guided by laws and norms, running the state's daily affairs under the watchful eye of their peers. Now, Aristotle, he was quite impressed by this, what he saw as an ingenious arrangement. He explains that it prevented any tribe or region from dominating, and it trained many citizens in governance by giving each tribe a turn at leadership. It also created a sense of unity. Each tribe knew it had essential responsibilities for a part of that year. During their prytany, the 50 prytanies even dined together at public expense in the tholos, a round building in the agora, emphasizing collegiality and constant availability. Some of them even stayed overnight on duty, in case of urgent issues. Well, pretty much the Council of 500 was the metaphorical engine room of the Athenian democratic system, converting the people's broad power into daily decision-making and administration. Well, let's move to the third system in this, the third pillar of this democratic system. That is the people's Courts, the dikasteria. They were not permanent courts with professional judges, but rather just a large jury panel of citizens who were empowered to adjudicate legal cases and hold public officials accountable. Athens didn't have a single Supreme Court. Instead, different panels were formed for different trials, or on a as-needed basis. Of course, they were drawn from a massive pool of jurors. Each year, 6,000 citizens over the age of 30, remember, volunteered for this and were selected by lot as heliasts, jurors eligible to serve during that year. On a trial day, a subset of those would be further allotted to a specific jury. Juries were large, commonly 501 citizens for important cases, sometimes as high as over 1,000 or even 1,501. That was always an odd number, by the way. They couldn't have an even number. Had to have an odd one to prevent any ties. God, you can imagine a tie between 1,500 people. That had to cause some arguments. Well, that's why you have to have 1,501. For lesser private lawsuits, juries might be 201 or 401 in size. The guiding principle was similar to that of the assembly: mass participation to dilute the influence of bribery or intimidation, and to respect the collective reason of the people. As for the Athenian juries, they sat for one-day trials, from morning until the verdict. There were no judges giving instructions. Magistrates only facilitated the procedure. Each side in a case, prosecution and defense, presented speeches, often written by professional speech writers but delivered by the litigants themselves. Timers, like the clepsydra, that is a water clock of sorts, ensured that each side had equal allotted time to speak, underscoring the democratic values of fairness once again. As for the evidence, well, that could include witness testimony, often given in written affidavits, laws read aloud, and in some cases, torture testimony from slaves. A little bit harsh, but the ancient world is the ancient world, right? But ultimately it was the logos, the spoken argument, that had to persuade the mass of jurors. After hearing both sides, the jurors would cast secret ballots, for example by dropping bronze tokens into urns to determine guilt or innocence, and sometimes to choose between proposed penalties. A simple majority ruled, of course. There was no appeal from the jury's decision. The significance of courts in the democratic system was quite immense, too. They served as a check upon magistrates and politicians. If an official abused his power, or a citizen proposed an unlawful decree, he could be prosecuted before a jury of his fellow citizens. Let's take a little example. We've mentioned the legal procedure of graph paranomon, which allowed any citizen to accuse another of introducing a law that was unconstitutional or harmful. A jury would then decide the case, potentially voiding the law, and in some cases, punishing the proposer. Punishment, of course, being a rather wide term. Usually they wouldn't throw you off the cliff. Fingers crossed. This effectively replaced ostracism in the late 4th century as a more precise mechanism to restrain demagogues or bad policy. Even during the 5th century, the possibility of audit and prosecution loomed over public figures. Generals and treasurers had to give account of their actions at the end of their terms, a process, by the way, called euthymna, or they could face trial for any misdeeds. We got a pretty good example of this: the trial of 6 generals after the Battle of Arginusue in 406 BCE. The assembly, furious at the generals' failure to rescue survivors after the naval battle, referred them to a trial that resulted in their collective execution, a decision widely criticized later as hasty and unjust. Notably, Socrates, serving as a rotation chairman in the assembly that day, refused to put the blatantly illegal mass trial motion to vote. One principled man against a very angry crowd. Takes a lot of guts. Well, the court system also gave ordinary citizens a direct say in upholding justice and the laws. Famous trials like that of Socrates in 399 BCE took place before a jury of 501 citizens. In the case of Socrates, who was prosecuted for impiety and corrupting the youth, the jury voted to convict him by a relatively close margin. And then, in a second vote on the penalty, they chose death over exile. This outcome, recorded in Plato's Apology, has often been cited as a dark side of democracy, the condemnation of a great philosopher due to a combination of prejudice, scapegoating, and the oratorical skills of his accusers. Yet in the Athenian eye, the trial of Socrates was an example of the demos exercising its legitimate authority to enforce communal values. The courts could be swayed by passion or clever rhetoric, just as the assembly could. But they also reflected collective common sense on many occasions. Juries were, after all, large cross-sections of the citizenry, and litigants often tailored their arguments to appeal to broad civic ideals like patriotism, piety, and, well, after all, democratic equality. In fact, our knowledge of how Athenians viewed their democracy is richly informed by this surviving forensic speech records that we have. In these speeches, orators praised the laws of Athens, the quality of its juries, and the principle that poor and rich alike receive equal justice. As one speechwriter declares, addressing the jurors, "You, the many, are the city. The laws and decrees are yours. Through you, the city stands." Well, certainly flattering words. And such words, albeit flattery, were essentially true in a literal sense. But who were the people that made this democratic system work? And how actively did they participate? Well, the answer reveals both the inclusiveness but also the limits of Athenian democracy. You see, citizenship in Athens was a prized status. By Pericles' citizenship law of 451 BCE, it was restricted to those born of an Athenian father and an Athenian mother. Although earlier one Athenian parent sufficed, Pericles tightened the criterion. Citizens had to be male, and usually at least 18 years old, to be registered in a deme. They typically began attending assembly at 20. Now, as for women, regardless of birth, well, they didn't have any political rights. They couldn't vote, speak, or hold office, as Greek society saw public political life as a male domain. Well, enslaved people, too, which was a substantial portion of the population, were of course excluded entirely, as were metics, the resident foreigners who were often vital to Athens' economy but had no rights as citizens. These exclusions are pretty stark from a modern perspective, sure, but among the Greek states at the time, Athens was relatively broad in granting all male citizens, whether rich aristocrats or poor laborers, equal votes in the assembly and courts. This was the equality that Greek writers called isonomia. I love all the Greek words in this. They're charming, aren't they? But in practice, not every citizen was politically active. Participation required being physically present in Athens on meeting days, which could be a challenge for those living in distant villages or busy with their own harvests. Work had to be done, of course. You couldn't just leave the farm. So the assembly initially did not offer any pay for attendees. Pay for assembly meetings was introduced later, in the late 5th or 4th century, to encourage turnout. And that is a bit of an example of where we can see that turnout was not as expected. Jury service, on the other hand, that was compensated, thanks to Pericles, who around the mid-5th century arranged for jurors to receive a small stipend, perhaps 3 obols a day, roughly equivalent to a worker's daily wage, so you're not really losing anything by showing up, so that even poor citizens could afford to take time for public duty. By reducing the economic barrier to participation, Athens moved closer to the ideal of broad involvement, and indeed many observers remarked on the enthusiasm which ordinary Athenians engaged in their democratic process. Let's look at the comic playwright Aristophanes. He provides a bit of a tongue-in-cheek perspective on citizen participation. In his play, The Acarnanians, is that right? Yes, Acarnanians, excuse me, produced in 425 during the Peloponnesian War, the protagonist, Diceopolis, gripes about his fellow citizens' apathy and tardiness. You see, Diceopolis arrives early on the Pinks, and finds it empty at start time, and complains that no one comes until much later, and only after stopping by the Agora marketplace. He quips that people try to, quote, dodge the red-stained rope that the Scythian police of sorts used to corral them to the meeting, just the one we mentioned in the introduction. This humorous scene suggests that some Athenians needed prodding to attend, preferring to loiter around in the markets. Yet the subtext is that, one way or another, citizens did turn out when it mattered. By the play's end, the assembly meeting is crowded and chaotic, full of shouting and interruptions, another satirical exaggeration of democratic disorder. Aristophanes pokes fun at the boisterous, heckling atmosphere of real assembly debates, where passionate interjections and even insults could fly. The picture that emerges is lively and far from decorous, but fundamentally one of mass engagement, a polity where even rustics from the countryside feel they have a say, and indeed might vote to make peace if they were tired of war, as in Diceopolis' case. But the comedy aside, evidence indicates that thousands of Athenians did attend regularly. Perhaps Aristophanes was just writing a little bit of a nice story for us. Of course, many more would attend on the extraordinary occasions. Civic participation had become a part of the social fabric. Citizens would talk politics in the agora, in the barber shops, at their dining clubs, and soak in information from public speeches, festival plays, and inscriptions of new laws, always put out on public display. The everyday mechanics of participation also included some ingenious approaches to fairness. The Athenians recognized the potential for bias or corruption in selecting citizens for duties, so they invented machines like the kleroterion, a randomization device using slots and colored balls to assign jurors or magistrates by lot. Now this was an interesting little machine because it prevented bribery or faction from controlling who served on a given day. It was essentially a lottery system raised to a civic principle. In Aristotle's words, the Athenians believed, quote, to be governed by the best men is to be oligarchic. To be governed by the lot is democratic. Thus, aside from generals and a few key experts, most offices were filled by lot. Not just the council, but also lower magistrates, etc., the 10 commissioners of the public works, the 10 controllers of the market, etc., typically one from each tribe, were allotted annually. Even the 9 archons, once the top magistrates in the pre-democratic era, were by the mid-5th century chosen by lot from a pool of nominees, and this marked a huge shift from aristocratic privilege to ordinary citizen rule. It meant that a man of modest means, with no famous family name, might find himself archon for a year, overseeing courts or religious festivals. Now, in earlier times, that was completely unimaginable. But despite the egalitarian mechanisms, Athenian democracy had its informal leaders and politicians in the sense of the influential speakers. These were often referred to as rhetores or orators, or sometimes demagogoi, leader of the people, a term that could be respectful or scornful. They held no official power by virtue of their status, but through charisma and skill they could guide public opinion. And if you want an example of one, Pericles is right at the top. Elected as one of the 10 strategoi generals year after year, he was a brilliant speaker and strategist who came to dominate Athenian politics for decades. Thucydides famously says that Athens under Pericles was, quote, in name a democracy, but in fact rule by the first man. It was a testament to Pericles' persuasive authority. He could usually convince the majority to follow his policies, giving him a unique position. However, Pericles wasn't around forever, wasn't he? After his death, no single figure could ever have that level of consistent influence, and power fluctuated more among rival orators. Importantly, the system had no official opposition or parties as in modern parliamentary politics. Factions did form, of course, supporters of more aggressive war policy versus peace advocates. But these were fluid groupings around prominent individuals or issues, not disciplined parties with platforms of their own. Each issue was debated on its own merits or demerits, and alignments could shift accordingly. This issue-by-issue direct deliberation is part of what made Athenian democracy so vibrant, but also at times inconsistent or fickle. The same demos that voted to launch the Sicilian expedition in 415 amid Alcibiades' grand promises could reverse policy abruptly as events soured, eventually leading to trials and exiles for some proponents of that failed adventure. But that's a story for another time, I suppose. And so is Alcibiades. Of course, Athenian Democrats were keenly aware that empowering the masses carried risks. Demagogues could mislead, majorities could trample rights, and enemies of the system, whether foreign or domestic, could seek to overthrow it. Thus, they designed safeguards and accountability mechanisms to protect the democracy from implosion or subversion. We've already mentioned some: ostracism, graph paranomon, dokimasia, that is screening, and euthymia, audit for officials. And the sheer size of bodies like juries as protection against bribery, of course. But let's get a bit more into the measures and how effective they actually were. We'll start with ostracism. Everybody has a brief idea of what that is. We've all heard the word ostracized and know the connotations. It was perhaps the most dramatic safeguard. It was essentially a preemptive strike against potential tyrants or overly dominant politicians. Each year the assembly was asked, do we need an ostracism this year? If a majority voted yes, a special meeting was held a few weeks later where citizens scratched a name on pottery shards and cast their ballot into urns. If at least 6,000 votes were cast, the person whose name appeared on the most ostraka was exiled for 10 years. Now, the exile was not a dishonorable exile. The ostracized one got to keep their property and could come back later. It was more of a cooling off period, a removal from the political scene. Kind of like when your boss asks you to take leave, or a suspension from school, but under better circumstances. Of course, the measure was used sparingly, perhaps a dozen times in the 5th century. Famous statesmen like Aristides the Just and Themistocles, the architect of the victory at Salamis, were ostracized, as was the demagogue Hyperbolos. The institution had a mythic founding, too. It was said to have been instituted because the tyrant Peisastratos had used his power to support, popular support rather, to seize power. So, never again would Athens let one man's popularity or ambition subvert the state. And there's an anecdote from Plutarch, too, that shows both the caprice and wisdom of this system of ostracism. During the ostracism vote of 482, Aristides the Just, known for his integrity, encountered an illiterate citizen who handed him a potsherd, and asked him to write Aristides. Surprised, Aristides inquired if he had ever wronged the man. "No," came the reply. "I don't even know him. I'm just tired of hearing him called the Just everywhere." Now, it's perhaps a little bit apocryphal, but that's what Plutarch tells us. Well, Aristides dutifully wrote his own name down, and indeed he was ostracized that year. The story, whether true or not, shows that even a sterling reputation could backfire, and that ostracism sometimes reflected public sentiment in mysterious ways. Nevertheless, ostracism did succeed in removing tensions. Aristides was recalled a few years later when the Persian threat loomed, suggesting no lasting grudge. Ostracism was a blunt instrument, and by the end of the 5th century it fell out of use, replaced by legal indictments as a more precise tool. Well, next we have legal accountability, this graph paranomon. Starting around the late 5th century, the Athenians developed a legal procedure called graph paranomon, that is, indictment against illegal proposals, which kind of functioned as a constitutional check on the assembly's decrees. If a citizen proposed a decree to another citizen, and that other citizen believed contradicting existing law was harmful, well, that first citizen could sue the other citizen in court. A jury of citizens would then judge the case, effectively judging the wisdom or legality of the decree in question. If the proposer lost, the decree was annulled, and he could face fines or disenfranchisement. This created a strong incentive for those speaking in the assembly to ensure that their proposals were lawful and well considered. It was a kind of judicial review. But remember, it was citizens reviewing citizens, not a separate judicial case reviewing legislators as in modern system. Well, in Athens, the lawmakers and jurors were drawn from the same pool of citizens in different contexts. The graph paranomon helped to moderate the volatility of the assembly, especially in the 4th century, by weeding out the impetuous or patently self-serving measures after the fact. Well, next we have the scrutiny of officials, the dokimasia and euthymna. All incoming office holders underwent a dokimasia, whether they were elected or allotted, essentially a vetting or examination before they assumed office. This was not an examination of skills, but rather civic standing and loyalty. Magistrates were asked questions like, "Do you pay your taxes? Do you honor the gods? Have you treated your parents well?" to ensure that they were upstanding citizens. A candidate could be disqualified for notorious misbehavior or failing to meet requirements, for example, not being a citizen or being in debt to the treasury. Then, after a term in office, officials faced the euthymna, an audit. They had to report on finances handled and could be accused of misconduct. The accounting was reviewed by auditors, and any citizen could lodge a complaint which might lead to a trial. These measures kept officials, who were often amateurs serving brief terms, more honest, since they knew their fellow citizens would scrutinize their tenure. For major officers like the treasurers of the Delian League funds, the stakes were quite high. Misappropriation could result in severe penalties. You know what I mean. But then we had term limits and collegiality too. To prevent the entrenchment of power, almost all officers had short terms, often 1 year, and collegial rule, multiple people holding the same office, that is. Let's give an example. Athens elected the 10 generals, strategoi, annually, 1 per tribe, rather than a single commander-in-chief. These generals could be re-elected, and often were, but they still operated as a board of 10 equals. In debates, generals like Pericles or Nicias had to persuade their co-generals in the assembly of their strategy. They could not simply command by fiat. Other boards of 10 included the archons, the inspectors of public works, and so on. And even in military expeditions, multiple generals might share command, which sometimes, of course, caused friction and reflected the democratic suspicion of one-man rule. The concept of rotation in governance extended even to religious festivals and minor magistracies. Though no one was really supposed to hold power for too long. Some positions could only be held once ever, and this fostered a remarkable turnover. It meant hundreds of citizens each year got first-hand experience in governance. Over a generation, thousands would have served at least once on the council, or as a minor magistrate, or as a juror, creating a citizenry that was politically invested and quite informed. Well, next we have the military structure, which also reinforced democratic participation. The hoplite army, composed of citizen soldiers who could afford armor, gave the middle-class citizens, farmers, artisans, that is, a sense of stake in the game. They literally defended the city. The poorer citizens who could not afford armor served as rowers in the massive Athenian navy, or as light infantry, especially during the 5th century wars. These thetes, as they were called, lowest class, were crucial to Athens' naval empire, and thus gained political clout commensurate with their service. It is often noted, too, that Athenian naval power and radical democracy grew together. Let's look at Salamis in 480 BCE. There, and throughout the 5th century, it was the rowing masses who propelled Athens to victory and empire, and in turn, the democracy rewarded them with equal political rights. Indeed, after the Persian Wars, leaders like Ephialtes and Pericles further democratized the system, for example, stripping the aristocratic Areopagus Council of its remaining members in 462, a reform attributed to Ephialtes. This can be seen as partly a class victory, the common citizens asserting that those who fight and bleed for Athens should also govern it. And, well, it's hard to argue with that, isn't it? But Athenian democracy didn't exist in a vacuum. It was intertwined with the city's vibrant intellectual and cultural life. The 5th century BC was Athens' golden age, not only for democracy, but for drama, art, philosophy. The open, debate-filled atmosphere of the democracy perhaps helped stimulate a tradition of candid expression and public critique. The theatre, for instance, was a semi-sacred space where citizens watched tragedies and comedies, and that often had a lot of political undertones, no different to our modern day, I suppose. It is remarkable that Aristophanes could lampoon leading politicians, Cleon in the Knights, or Euripides as a caricature intellectual in the Acarnanians and the Frogs. He would do this in front of large citizen audiences, and it suggests a society that tolerated dissenting humor, priding itself on free speech, up to a point. In fact, the term parrhesia, frank speech, became associated with democratic citizenship, the right to speak one's mind, even irreverently in public forums. Athenian comedy's very existence, making the assembly or law courts a butt of jokes, is evidence that the democracy could laugh at itself, and was thus confident in its identity. But at the same time, serious philosophers grappled with the nature of democracy itself. Socrates, who lived through the Peloponnesian War, and the democratic tumult that followed it, of course, was famously skeptical of pure majority rule. He often used analogies. Would you trust a random crowd to decide on a ship's course or to perform surgery, rather than a trained captain or doctor? Well, this line of reasoning appears in Plato's dialogues as the critique of democracy's premise that every citizen's opinion on policy is equally valid. Plato, in his Republic, has Socrates described democracy as a charming yet flawed constitution. Quote, democracy is a charming form of government full of variety and disorder, and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. In Plato's eyes, the freedom and equality of democracy are superficially attractive, a many-colored cloak, but without discernment, since even those with knowledge have an equal say. Plato worried that unbridled freedom would lead to anarchy, and eventually the people, craving order, would fall prey to a tyrant. Well, this is a tragic cycle that he outlines. Democracy always degenerates into tyranny. Indeed, Plato's teacher, Socrates, was a victim of this democratic process, which surely influenced his negative assessment. And then we have Aristotle. He wrote a generation later, taking a more empirical and balanced view of his politics. He recognized democracy, the rule of the many, as one of the three basic forms of government, along with monarchy and oligarchy, each with a good version and a corrupt version. You see, for Aristotle, a polity, a mixed constitution, was ideal, but he acknowledged that of pure forms a moderate democracy could be stable and just. He argued that a collective multitude might actually make better decisions than a small group of elites. Quote, as a feast to which all contribute is better than a banquet furnished from a single purse. Yeah, fair enough. It was a remarkably modern-sounding defense of group wisdom. However, Aristotle also cautioned against extreme democracy, what he called where the law can be overridden by the mass of people's decrees. He documented Athens in his Athenian constitution, seemingly unimpressed by how evolved the system had laws and courts to channel people's power. Yet he did note attention. If the people can do whatever they want, demos itself becomes like a king, an unchecked sovereign. Athens managed this tension by binding itself to procedures and by internal criticism. The presence of philosophic schools, as Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, shows a society analyzing itself. Not all Athenians would agree with Plato's harsh verdict, but the ideas were certainly in the air. And finally, religion in Athens coexisted with democracy in a seemingly complementary manner. Many public officers had religious duties, etc. One of the 9 archons, the Archon Basilius, oversaw sacred rites and presided in religious court cases, such as, for example, impiety trials. Festivals, which were, of course, deeply religious, were also state-sponsored and democratized. The great Dionysia festival, with drama competitions too, was arranged by officials and often funded by wealthy citizens performing a liturgy of sorts. a kind of public service obligation. Now, this union of civic and sacred life meant that the democratic government took on functions that elsewhere might be reserved for priestly authorities. The assembly could vote on sending consults to oracles, or on instituting new cults. We find decrees establishing altars or offering thanks to gods after battles, decisions made by people collectively. Interestingly, some traditional checks on democracy's excess were couched in religious terms. For example, if an assembly meeting was disrupted by ill omens, like a sudden rainstorm or eclipse, it might be adjourned, as the gods were signaling their disapproval. Also, certain sensitive trials, like for sacrilege or homicide, were left to the old aristocratic courts. Areopagus, for example, in his homicide case. Or perhaps special juries would be brought in, reflecting a respect for customary law and divine sanction. But on the whole, Athenians believed that their gods approved of democracy. In tragedy and literature, hubris, that overwhelming arrogance, was typically punished by the gods, and the tyrant was the ultimate hubristic figure. Democracy, by contrast, was often associated with the aidos and dike, the spirits of respect and justice, upholding a community where all free men had dignity. Herodotus, in a semi-legendary anecdote, even describes a debate among Persian nobles where one, Otanes, extols what sounds like Greek democracy. Quote from Herodotus: I wish to entrust matters to the multitude, for monarchy has neither sweet name nor good thing, but the rule of the many has first the most beautiful name of all, equality, isonomia, that is, and secondly, it does none of the things a monarch does. The offices are held by lot, the magistrate is accountable, and all deliberates together. Well, though Herodotus puts these words in a Persian's mouth, it is clearly a Greek ideal being voiced. And indeed, those features, selection by lot, accountability of officials, collective deliberation, and so on, they were all hallmarks of Athenian democracy, and certainly celebrated almost as sacred values. So really, to sum it all up, what can we say about Greek democracy? Well, the Greek democracy, especially in its Athenian incarnation, was bold and in many ways successful, but all in all an experiment in mass self-government. For approximately 2 centuries between 508 and 322 BCE, the Athenians navigated the challenges of empowering ordinary people to make extraordinary decisions. They built a state run by paid jurors and volunteer office holders. They defended their land and liberty against the Persian invasion and established a far-flung naval empire in the Delian League. All this under a governance that Pericles proudly accounts, quote, afforded equal justice to all their private disputes, and held that ability, not class, advanced a man in public life. But the reality, of course, is more complex than the ideal. Ability mattered, yes, but practically so did rhetoric, and not everyone was truly equal in influence or bravery. Charismatic figures could sway the masses better. Yet the system allowed for self-correction, you see. When Athens overreached, as in the Sicilian expedition disaster, or fell into internal strife, as in the civil stasis after the war, it was the collective citizens that ultimately restored balance. The post-403 democracy even extended a general amnesty to reconcile oligarchic collaborators back into the community, a remarkable act of political healing by popular decree. By the masses, for the masses. Well, thank you very much for listening. Didn't we have fun? I thought we did. Well, I'm going to read the top tier patrons and YouTube members out. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Neil, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Nerona, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, and Brittany. Thank you so much. And I will see you in the next video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts down in the comments. Perhaps you write something about our modern democracies. I don't live in the same country as you, most likely. But, yeah, let's share some ideas. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.